As promised, today we're diving into the best of the best, every Mr. Olympia champion, and this time we're focusing on their weakest points. In our last video, we explored the standout body parts that made legends from Larry Scott to Samson Daa famous. Now, we're flipping the script to highlight the flaws they overcame to make history. This time, let's start with our last and current Mr. Olympia Samson Daa and work our way backwards. Samson is very complete with few weaker body parts, however nobody is without flaw. For example, his biceps development is often criticized for the lack of details and separation, but my choice for Samson's weakest body part is his abs development. He's lacking deep separation and also has that unesthetic split between the left and right sides. Next is the 2023 Mr. Olympia Derek Lansford. With Derek, it is different as he's got certain wow factor points but also some pretty weak ones. He's been often criticized for his chest or his abs, especially after he won in 2023. However, at the 2024 Mr. Olympia, he drastically improved on these 2 points. While his abs remain a good choice for his weakest part, I would actually go with his legs from the front and especially the quad sweeps that he really needs to step up in 2025. Up next is the fan favorite Hadi Chupan, the 2022 Olympian. In my opinion, Hadi Chupan has a flaw that should be obvious for everybody. Some say it's his back. However, his back is pretty decent and his back lat spread may actually be one of the best in the world today. His weakest flaw is his shoulders for sure. Despite being or not enhanced, they look pretty terrible from some angles and is definitely Hadi's Achilles heel. Up next we have Big Ramee, the 2-time champion, and with him it's different. If we're talking prime Ramee, which I believe is before he ever won the Olympia, his biggest flaw was conditioning and as a muscle group probably the calves. But during his reign as Mr. Olympia, his biggest flaw was definitely his back as his lower lats literally atrophied and completely disappeared. Up next, we have Brandon Curry, the 2019 Mr. Olympia, and we all know what his biggest flaw is. We can include here the whole lower body because all the muscle groups were underwhelming, especially compared to his world-class upper body. Choosing between his quads, glutes, hams, and calves, probably his calves are the worst, but as calves are pretty much ignored by judges today, I could go with his hamstrings. It's worth mentioning that his hanging hamstring looked more than decent from the side though. Next up we have the 2018 champion Sha Rhoden. During his career he had 2 bigger flaws in my opinion. One was always his back, especially since he was battling Phil, Kai and Dexter, all with great backs. And also his triceps, as his biceps looked good before 2018. However, in 2018, his biceps downsized a lot, but I would still consider his triceps his biggest flaw, especially the lateral head which was flat as a pancake to quote Mikey's Iron Rage, but I digress. Up next, we have one of the GOATs, the 7-time Mr. Olympia, Phil Heath. Phil was probably the closest to bodybuilding perfection muscle group by muscle group. He wasn't lacking anything except for maybe better abs development. Later on, his midsection proved to be his biggest flaw for different reasons, him having to deal with a nasty hernia that led to him dropping the title to Shawn eventually in 2018. But regardless of the hernia, his abs and midsection have always been his only major flaw. Next is Dexter Jackson, the 2008 Mr. Olympia. Dexter was a smaller bodybuilder but a very complete one. Even his abs looked world-class during his prime. His only major flaw was actually his calves, which had never been at the same level as the rest of his lower body and the rest of his physique overall. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the subscribe button as I'm aiming for that 30k subs milestone. Then we have the 4-time Mr. Olympia, the cut above the rest, Jay Cutler. Jay had a blockier physique and maybe not the most ideal proportions, with shorter limbs and a longer torso. However, muscle group by muscle group, he was complete from top to bottom. In my opinion, the only body part that wasn't world class for him was the back, for which he is remembered as being weak. He wasn't weak, it just wasn't at the same level. Plus, he had to deal with Ronnie and Phil, who are known for their backs. Still, Jay's biggest flaw remains the back. Up next, we have the greatest of all time, Ronnie the King Coleman, and we all know that he basically had only two major flaws. His abs and his triceps lateral head. Some say his calves, but I don't agree. While he didn't have calves like Dorian, I wouldn't consider Ronnie's calves a weak point. His triceps could be the option for some of you, but in my opinion, the shape of his abs was always his biggest flaw, even before his midsection got wider. That nasty split in the middle and that weird four-pack were never pleasant to watch. Next is Dorian Yates, the six-time Mr. Olympia. Dorian Yates was a case of half of his body parts being arguably the greatest of all time, but the other half was not, with some body parts being actually quite weak, especially in comparison to the other GOATs, because Dorian is one of the greatest. His chest, his arms and his shoulders were pretty underwhelming, but he always posed around his weaknesses, showcasing his strengths. Some mention his quad sweeps, but overall, his legs were pretty strong. His biggest flaw would definitely be the biceps, even before the injury. Then we have another GOAT, the 8-time Mr. Olympia, Lee Haney. As we go further and further back, we should also calibrate to the standards. If compared to later eras, Lee Haney's legs, especially from the back, could be considered a weak point. But for the 80s, having striated glutes and hamstrings wasn't the norm. His calves were very weak as well. But as for his biggest flaw, I would go with his abs. Similar to Ronnie and Samson, Lee also had a nasty split between his abs. In my opinion, his abs looked the worst out of them. Up next is the 1983 Mr. Olympia, Samir Banu, who I had to literally go back and watch some of his footage to try to find a weak point. He was indeed a smaller bodybuilder but was very complete, and for the time I couldn't find anything really. He had great arms, a goat back, good abs and midsection, good quads and world-class calves. The only thing I can take away from him in 1983 are the hamstrings, but remember, nobody had hamstrings like nowadays. Back then, that was the norm. However, I can't find anything else for that 1983 physique. Besides that winning version, Samir struggled. He never finished more than top 6 at the O and won only one more pro show, despite doing more than 30 other shows. Next up, we have the 1982 Mr. Olympia, Chris Dickerson, and his biggest flaw is more than obvious. It's the arms and especially the biceps. Like I was saying in our previous video, Chris was pretty balanced throughout his physique without standout flashy body parts. However, he has one flashy flaw besides his weaker biceps, his pointy elbows, which were a distracting factor. Next is the 3-time Mr. Olympia, Frank Zane. He was the lightest ever Mr. Olympia, but he didn't have to be heavy as his perfect symmetry and proportions made him one of the most iconic bodybuilders of all time. Just like in Samir's case, I actually had to go back and watch some footage with him and try to figure out his weaknesses. For that time, Frank Zane didn't have any obvious flaws except for, again, his hamstrings. That was the criterion back then, but in the absence of another obvious flaw, I'm going with the hamstrings. Next, we have the 2-time Mr. Olympia, Franco Columbo. After he won the 1981 Mr. Olympia, his biggest flaw was definitely his legs, but that wasn't his prime, and truth be told, that wasn't a deserved win. However, during his prime in the 70s, Franco's legs were quite strong for the time. His biggest flaw, especially for that era, was his arms. When every top athlete had great arms, Franco's biceps were his biggest flaw in his prime, in my opinion. Up next we have the great, the one and only Arnold Schwarzenegger. Maybe almost as similar to Dorian Yates, the Oak had some iconic muscle groups, but also some where he was quite underwhelming. I would mention his triceps and his legs, for which he was criticized, especially in 1975. Some say his shoulders, but back then, nobody had cannon shoulders like today. Arnold's biggest flaw when he was in his absolute prime, say 1973 to 1974, was his waist. He had a wide waist but always knew how to pose around it. If you pick a certain muscle group, I would say his 4-pack abs, which were a weak point for a body that excelled in perfection. Next we have the 3-time Mr. Olympia Sergio Oliva, and he's definitely the one with the least amount of flaws out of the entire list, and unlike Samir, he's got a perfect structure as well. However, Sergio's Achilles heel has been conditioning even for the time. It's said that he wasn't doing anything special during prep for a show and was counting on his incredible genetics only. However, if I had to pinpoint a weakness, I would say his abs. I've never seen any picture of him with decently defined abs. Last but not least is the first ever Mr. Olympia Larry Scott. As I was saying in our previous video, since at the time aesthetics were quite common for athletes, this was not a trait that would define Larry Scott, as he had a pretty wide waist and not the best abdominals. So just like for Arnold and Sergio, for Larry as well, we have the midsection and the abs as his weakest flaw. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the worst body parts of every Mr. Olympia champion, be sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more videos like this.